So I think we have everything, everyone, or people can continue to come on in. So I'm just going to start right in here. According to the Government Accountability, oh, I should probably introduce myself. Hi, my name is James Mae. I am a freelance journalist. I focus on politics and policy. I'm based out of DC, where I'm pursuing my master's in journalism at Georgetown. So I'm kind of new to the area. And I have the lovely opportunity to explore the topic of FOIA and AI tonight. I also serve on the SPJ Freelance Community Board, in addition to being involved with SPJ DC and SPJ International. So with that, according to the Government Accountability Office's 2024 report on the Freedom of Information Act, there were 206,720 backlog federal FOIA requests at the end of fiscal year 2022. This backlog continues to grow on both the federal and state levels. The backlog, combined with the recent firings of FOIA officers and downsizing of federal agencies, is causing increased delays in fulfilling FOIA requests, making it harder for journalists, activists, and the public to conduct government oversight. One solution proposed to deal with the backlog is AI. In 2023, NBC reported that the CDC, the Department of Justice, and the State Department started using AI platforms like FOIA Assist from, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Mitra Group, to sort and help fulfill FOIA requests. And now some are proposing AI should be used from the requester's side. Here to help us explore this issue is Alex Ebermann, who is president of the New York Coalition on Open Government, where he promotes open government practices to hold public officials accountable. Axel is an experienced communication strategist, advocate, and AI expert who has been recently researching AI's effect on communication. And then we have Irvin McCullough. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. Who is the co-founder of FOIA Friend, a startup building AI tools to help journalists draft and handle high-quality, easy-to-process Freedom of Information Act requests. A former investigator for the U.S. Senate and freelance journalist, Irvin consults across the nonprofit and policy worlds, advising whistleblowers, drafting whistleblower protection legislation, and helping nonprofit organizations launch policy initiatives. So Axel, Irvin, thank you so much for being here tonight. We gratefully accept your presence. We will get into the discussion in a second, but first, if any member of the audience has a question, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. I will try to incorporate your questions as we go along in this discussion, but we do want to keep that chat box clear. Dan Kupsky with the SPJ DC chapter is working things in the background for this discussion, and we'll be putting links and other information relevant to the discussion in the chat box. So, first, let's start with the basic question. Should journalists be using FOIA in the requesting process? Irvin, could you please go first?
Absolutely. And I'm happy. Thank you again for being here, for inviting us here. And thank you all to the audience for tuning in at 6 p.m. on a Monday here in the East Coast in the US. Like James said, my name is Irvin McCullough. I'm the co-founder of FOIA Friend and a consultant for a few nonprofits like the Government Accountability Project, where I work on whistleblowers' legal teams. To answer the question directly, yes, absolutely. Journalists should be using FOIA as part of their regular reporting process. I got my start filing FOIA requests when I was an undergrad intern with the Government Accountability Project. And it turned out that I would read all the different FOIA logs at the different government agencies, and I would think, hey, that's a really good request. I would see the different stories that mention the good documents that they got through FOIA requests. And at the same time, I kept on having different ideas of requests to file. And I would check the FOIA logs to see if any journalists had already filed those requests. And usually, no, they hadn't filed the request. I was often the first person to file a request for a document that just upon reading some news article or tuning into a congressional hearing, I thought, hey, there's going to be some documents here, and those documents are going to be newsworthy. They'll actually help chase some type of story that will make some type of message or some type of impact. And that's really how I got into filing FOIA requests. It's just something you can very easily do. You can climb the learning curve. It's not that steep. Or, like Dan put in the chat, you can go to FOIA-friend.com, which is an AI tool that a friend and I made to make it easier for journalists to draft high quality, easy to process FOIA requests. We can get into that later, but really, everyone should be using FOIA if you are a journalist. Yes.
Then, Axel, what's your thoughts on that?
So, we are the Near Coalition for Open Government, so we deal mostly, but that's just the state body of FOIA with FOIL, because basically, obviously, FOIA is just for federal agencies, and a lot of stuff that is requested from local journalists, a lot of our members that are just community members or community organizers, is on the state level, right? So all of the different states have their respective freedom of information laws, which we call FOIL, Freedom of Information Law. And yes, I mean, in terms of the requesters, right? I'm fully on board with them using whatever tool they can use to file those FOIL and FOIA requests, right? Because it is helpful. I think it also helps streamline the process if you know how to use those tools. Because in all fairness, not all FOIA and FOIL requests are always properly worded and properly presented, which does create a lot of work on the side of the agencies, and nobody profits from that. So if the any AI basically results in writing better and more productive FOIL and FOIA requests, I'm 100% for it. May it be for journalists, for any FOIA requests, for interested citizens. I'm all for it. Now, just to preempt, that enthusiasm that I have for using it on the requester side is not matched by my enthusiasm to use AI on the governance side, but you can go into that later. I think there is a power imbalance, of course, in the FOIL and FOIA process, right? Especially from our members who are a lot of grassroots requesters, right? So especially if you're dealing with larger organizations or the federal government, they have a lot of resources, right, to understand the law, to look through it, to understand it properly. And if you are just a grassroots activist in a village somewhere in the state, you may not have all of those resources. And if AI can help you to streamline whatever you're doing, I think that is a fantastic tool.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, kind of getting into this, so if journalists do use AI, what are some prompts that we should be asking it to generate a good FOIA request? And then the second part of this question is, do you see any ethical concerns to using AI to generate these requests?
That's a great question. I'll take the in two parts, focusing first on kind of the prompts. When I first started using AI, it was the predecessor to ChatGPT. I was at a political fundraiser, and a friend of mine told me that he had found this program that let computers write effectively. He was using it to help bookstore owners write letters to the editor about book bans, opposing book bans. And I was like, wait, you're telling me that you can just tell some type of program that you want a letter to the editor and it'll spit out like a draft? That's huge for people in advocacy. I was like, oh, that's incredible. My first thought was, hey, can this actually write a FOIA request? Because I used to write these things all the time, and I would agonize for 30 minutes to 2 hours trying to get something absolutely perfect, so the FOIA officer knows where to look for the requested documents across the government, so the FOIA officer actually understands what it is I'm interested in, what I actually want to request. And when I went home and tried out that API, it was OpenAI's GPT-3, I believe, right before ChatGPT, and it absolutely sucked. The FOIA request that it generated was not good whatsoever. And it took me quite some time to, I just filed the idea in the back of my mind, and I thought, hey, maybe one of these days AI will be good enough to write a FOIA request, but that's far in the future, and I won't have to think about it until then. And so a few years went by. I was working in the Senate and was part of the Sergeant at Arms staff level working group for like AI governance and AI expertise, bringing in AI tools into the Senate, actually clearing them for Senate staff to use. And what the people would tell me, what they were using with the tools, where different capabilities were, just blew my mind. It simply astounded me as to where they thought the AI tools were. And I tried it out again when I left the Senate in December of, I want to say 2024. And it was incredible. It was absolutely incredible how much the tool had improved. How we went from GPT-3 to ChatGPT, and I could actually write some type of FOIA request that was understandable. And it wasn't something I'd send. It wasn't really good enough there. But once I actually had that little test, I thought, hey, this is possible, and this will become possible sometime soon. So I learned how to code and spun up a quick little prototype where I could actually try out a bunch of different prompts to see what gave me the best FOIA request. And ultimately, and this goes to your question, James, what kind of prompt do you want to type in? Uh, it is very hard to master, the whole prompt engineering thing. There are a lot of different ways to write a prompt. There are a lot small changes in prompts can significantly change the output you get. So what we did with FOIA Friend, instead of actually just having a prompt, giving journalists prompts to use, we built a whole system that's kind of on rails, that gives the user a lot of flexibility within deciding, to which agency do I want to brainstorm a request, that kind of stuff. So I would use FOIA Friend as opposed to just typing in a prompt. Although really, where ChatGPT is still useful to me for writing FOIA requests, and we're trying to bring in different features from where I see ChatGPT being useful, how we can put that into FOIA Friends so journalists can also get the utility of that, is in the research. And I truly do believe that every journalist must treat every FOIA request as a research project, right? This is not just something where you have an idea, you could just, spend about 10 seconds on a FOIA request. That's really not always courteous. There is a human on the other side of the FOIA request. There is an actual human being who will read the request, who will process the request, check for the documents, talk with their coworkers about it, go and try to talk to the folks inside the programs and the different offices in the agency. You don't really want to fire these things off willy-nilly and just send in kind of a bunch of wasteful requests or frivolous requests. So biggest recommendation I have is to treat it as a research project. There you can have all kinds of different prompts. ChatGPT's OpenAI's deep research product is really phenomenal. Google has a very good deep research product too. I would really recommend that folks actually do that kind of research before filing a big FOIA request. And we do bake some of that research into our brainstorming feature on the FOIA Friend tool. So if you go to FOIA-friend.com and you sign up, you'll be directed to essentially a text box, which is just a very average text box. You have two buttons on the text box. One says brainstorm, the other says rate on the brainstorm feature. Essentially, you can just throw in an article that you're interested in. You can write out essentially the idea you have for a FOIA request. You can put in a press release or a government document, and the tool will analyze that document. We have a bunch of prompts that we've tested on the back end, where essentially the flow is like it analyzes the document, it finds an agency and a FOIA office within that agency, or some type of subcomponent within that agency that probably has relevant records to the input. And then it will essentially scan the web, find different information gaps that is missing. So, for example, if you put in an article about Palantir getting some type of government contract at a various agency, you could throw that article in. It will say the agency that the contracting that Palantir got the contract with, and then it will actually go and check the web to find the contract number and like the terms that you would actually need in requesting that FOIA, writing that FOIA request. So I can't tell you how many FOIA officers I talk to that get requests for contracts and they have no idea which contract the requester is talking about. So we really try to bake in as much research as possible into FOIA Friend. So that way the system goes and does some research for you. But right now, again, that just shows how important it is to treat every FOIA request as a little research project.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you for that. We do have a question in the chat, and it kind of deals with the topic coming up. But before we get into that, does anyone real briefly want to touch on any like ethical considerations that we should be considering while using this tool?
Well, I mean, one thing is, and that is if you look at and Irvin touched on that earlier, there is a bit of a problem right now, and I acknowledge that, although I'm a little bit on the other side of the fence, that the number of requests on state level and federal level and municipal level, right? You basically have like requests that are hitting the federal government, right? They have staff, but you also might just have a part-time town clerk, right? Who's just answering FOIA requests, have never really got training for it, right? So now if on the other hand, you have somebody who's just firing off FOIA requests via ChatGPT and burying like that clerk in like 50 requests a day, right? At one point that becomes a problem, right? On a bunch of different levels. First of all, it kind of grinds that clerk to a standstill. Second, everybody else who may have filed legitimate or important FOIA requests just gets buried, right? FOIA requests often get answered in a certain order as it comes in. Only larger agencies prioritize it by easy to fulfill, hard to fulfill. So it could just be, I've seen it that they just stop answering at all, right?
Mhm.
Because they're like, we're getting so many. And I live in Mount Vernon. It's just in north of New York City. It's a city, mid-sized city, about 80,000 people. And they say it's a problem. They have two or three requesters that just apparently seem to be doing it for fun, right? And they said like the by far the largest volume of all of our FOIA requests comes from three people, and they just send us FOIA requests, our FOIA requests, asking for very large amounts of data that we need to look at. And they said we quite frankly don't have the manpower to handle it. And of course, that is where if you would have to sit down and type that out, right, you would be kind of just limited to a certain amount. If you can just have ChatGPT do it, or like right now, if you use an agent, right, an AI agent, they can do those for you. So you could literally it's almost like a denial of service attack, right? Just shut them down, right? By burying them in FOIA requests. And if you see, not even if it's vexatious requesters, but also just large volume requesters, you see that the system is creaking, right?
Mhm.
On the because it's become easier because it used to be you have to sit down, you got to type that thing out, and then you have to put it in the mail and send it in. There's a certain like gatekeeping function, right? Because you have to go to post office to mailbox. So you're not going to send 200 of those a day, right?
Mhm.
Now, pretty much all of the agencies, at least the larger ones, accept it online, right?
Mhm.
And as soon as it is online, anybody who has basic amount of tech knowledge can use an agent AI just to follow those requests, right? And
Mhm.
now they're becoming so good, and also just writing them out is so good that you can literally bury the agencies. And we heard it on a local, state, and we've seen it on a federal level. I just they just came out with a 2024 report, and they are drowning, right? I mean, it's going up, and it's going up
Mhm.
significantly. And I do think it is a resource question, and it also is fair to ask. And I talked to somebody at the board of election, right, where basically somebody didn't like the election outcome, and they just buried them in FOIA requests, right? There, it was basically just a retribution thing where they said, we're going to bury you in adversarial FOIA requests and just going to shut down your office. And so, in that sense, the automation that can come out of AI, right, can create legitimate problems.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So now we're getting into kind of the second half of the session, which I want to talk about AI and the terms of the fulfilling side, the fulfillment for your requests and some considerations there. So first, I want to start off this section with a question by one of our participants. They said, how can AI be used to help journalists and the public get records faster without creating new roadblocks or reducing accountability? Thank you for that question. Anyone can answer it.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a great, an absolutely phenomenal question. Essentially, I've talked to over 100 FOIA officers. When I first left the Senate and thought, hey, FOIA Friend will be actually very fun. This is going to be a good way to get people to use FOIA again. So many journalists had stopped using FOIA, and I worked in media relations in previous lives, and I talk with journalists often. I really do love journalism, and especially investigative journalism. And it would genuinely break my heart hearing from so many investigative journalists that would not use FOIA and didn't want to use FOIA because they'd say to me, "Hey, Irvin, I could spend an hour writing a FOIA request, and then over the next few weeks, I'm going to have calls to the FOIA office. I'm probably not going to get anything for the next year. I'm not going to get anything for, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in some cases, or longer." Uh, I thought, hey, how do we actually reverse this trend? People aren't using this phenomenal tool that Congress and the government created to let the public and let people in this country actually conduct citizen oversight, to know how funds are being spent, to know where there is waste, to be able to detect fraud, to be able to see abuses of power and get evidence for abuses of power. Actually, just abandoning that tool because it's not really working broke my heart. So I wanted to see how we could make it a bit better. I thought that we just had the conversation about bot sending, auto sending spam kind of requests. And I was very afraid that if journalists were able to too easily write too many FOIA requests, then we were just going to flood the system. And so I started talking to a lot of FOIA officers about how they plan to kind of deal with this. This is something that a lot of folks have been recognizing for a while. And the FOIA officers told me that I was very surprised when they told me this. The FOIA officers told me that their biggest problem was not too many requests, it was too many bad requests. It was poor requests that were kind of flooding the zone in a way where it was very obvious that the requesters had not done their research or done their homework to figure out how to actually succinctly, specifically locate the requests, the records that they needed to do their work or do their reporting. So I think overall, this, FOIA Friend is an attempt to fix that problem. It's to reverse that trend of too many FOIA requests being bad. It's to make every FOIA request a lot better. What we did essentially, and this is very old school AI, it's not large language models. The core of FOIA Friend is old school AI. It's machine learning from like the 90s, or technically 2010s. But essentially, what we did was trained a classifier, something that can usually traditionally will detect whether or not an email is spam in your inbox. We use that same kind of technology to essentially train a rater that can rate a FOIA request. And it will rate the FOIA request on 3 dimensions. One is clarity or specificity, second is scope, the third is compliance. And essentially, we fed this rater a lot of training data that we created by grabbing FOIA logs and seeing a bunch of bad FOIA requests, a bunch of good FOIA requests. We took all of that, the real FOIA requests, and we generated a bunch of synthetic FOIA requests that I went through manually and literally labeled every single one as to why this is a good FOIA request or why this is a bad FOIA request on each dimension. And now our users can essentially paste their request, and you'll figure out whether it's a good or a bad FOIA request pretty easily from our rater, 0 to 100 for each dimension. And that's when we actually call in the modern day AI, the large language models, to offer suggestions on how to improve the request. So you'll essentially have the rated request. If it's very poor, we don't let people send bad requests. If you don't score at least 50, you're not sending that request through our platform. But you will get suggestions on how to improve your score for each range. So on specificity, for example, I was just filing a FOIA request today that I wrote it totally manually, didn't use the AI brainstorm flow or anything like that. And I thought, hey, this is a fine request. It was not a fine request. It scored at like 48 out of 50. It wouldn't let me send it in. And I thought, hey, you know what? It's a bad request for very valid reasons. I was requesting a small set of emails that I thought would be a small set of emails from like one person by their title from like January to May of this year. And it turns out there were multiple people that had fulfilled that role from January to May. And there were a lot of just I didn't name a specific custodian there. I named like the kind of the title. I figured it out. I figured it out because of the LLM suggestions that I got. I pushed a few buttons. We updated the request, and the score was better, good enough to send. So overall, I think the requests that we want to send through FOIA Friend, the requests that journalists are going to be sending in the future with AI assistance, are probably going to be better requests. So I think having better requests that are easier to service is going to be a win for everyone.
And bouncing off that, Alvin, I'll give you probably like less than a minute to answer one of our attendees' questions. They ask, what is your view on the use of bots to file FOIA requests? They said that this has become a significant issue for federal agencies who are being bombarded by bot-generated FOIA requests.
I'm really curious about the bot generated requests there, because I hadn't I've feared this for a long time and I haven't seen all that many. I'd actually really like to see some examples of the bot generated requests, because the federal government doesn't exactly make it easy to submit the requests through the FOIA.gov API. Through FOIA, you can go to the FOIA.gov website, but programmatically, if you're like a hacker, right, like if you're actually trying to create a system to disrupt the government. It's relatively hard to actually submit requests programmatically through FOIA.gov. So I think there are a few things you could do in the back end to stop that problem, to stop like total bot submissions that are just totally spam. But if there's a flood of bad requests that are just obviously ChatGPT generated, I don't like those requests, and I want to definitely do things to stop them, to make sure there are fewer requests. All I want is to make sure we got good FOIA requests for FOIA officers to process.
Awesome, thank you. So now, as I mentioned in the beginning, government agencies have started to use AI to sort through these requests, to gather information from these requests and pool it. Now, Axel, I'm going to throw this conversation on over to you because during the session at Sunshine Fest, which was an annual government transparency festival here in DC earlier this spring. Axel, you mentioned during that session your concerns about using AI to fulfill FOIA requests. And I know you mentioned that earlier in this webinar. So could you kind of expand on some of those concerns?
Absolutely. Thank you. Um, so one thing where I think it works marvelously is proactive disclosure, right? Because FOIA and the large language AI and the large language models, they're very, very good at sifting through data, right? And I don't need to file a FOIA request for anything that you can just post as a database online, right? So if I can just log in online and find what I need, I don't need to file a FOIA request. It doesn't, clog up the process. So I think that is a good use of it, like very inconspicuous stuff that you literally just say, hey, we checked this, we vetted this as a subject to fall. We're just going to put it with a front-facing API somewhere and everybody can just access it. I'm fully on board with that. Where it becomes problematic, and this is how I saw that. So I was contacted Saratoga Springs, mid small community in New York State, and they were like, "Yo, you know what? We don't really have that much in terms of human resource to fulfill FOIL. We're just gonna outsource it. There's some shiny vendor at low price point. They're gonna from now process our AI FOIL requests via AI." And I said, "Well, here's what's gonna happen. Number one, AI systems are per definition black box principles, right? Not even the companies that run them understand what is going on inside these models. They're not auditable, right? They're playing catch up. Anthropic is trying to do it right now, but they're not very successful at it because the point of the AI is unlike any other algorithm that you just write, a linear old school one, stays the same until you change it. The AI constantly changes itself. That is why it gets better. It's machine learning. The thing learns by itself, right? So it's very hard sometimes to predict outcome. And the really big ones, OpenAI, ChatGPT, often they go like, "Whoa, we didn't know that thing could do that," right? So now that doesn't instill a lot of confidence in me when it comes to government processes, right? In terms of what will happen with that. Um, and we've seen it already. They rolled some of that back again with automatic sentencing guidelines, computer supported, where they used AI to do sentencing in court. And it produced really bad outcomes, right? And whenever somebody went up to the judge and said, "So why did this sentencing come across?" They were like, "Well, the computer told us though," right? Right. And if you said, "Well, what's your take on that?" They're like, "We don't know because they're buried in work," right? And they're happy that a computer and its plausible deniability, if the computer tells you, you didn't make a mistake, right? And I feel like that is a huge problem if this basically becomes a core. There's AI, the advantage and the problem of AI is that it's very fast and it's very cheap. And it's getting better and better and better. So there's a temptation of any kind of entity, and that would be a government agency, um, to just not expend resources on something that they don't feel is particularly beneficial to them. And FOIL and FOIA is something, it's a stepchild. They don't like that all too terribly much. And so why don't we just put this in the AI? And so they won't even understand anymore why the outcomes are that way. That decreases government transparency. Then when you go back and say, why did you deny me? They say, we don't know. The AI told us so. And it was like, well, can you find out why the AI told us so? They said, we don't know. These models are not auditable. And all of these models will be most proprietary. The government doesn't have its own large language models. So even they will most probably buy it as part of like some sort of software package, right? That's proprietary. So even if you're trying to find out why some decisions were made, A, they won't know. B, you couldn't audit it because it's a proprietary software that they bought, right? And I think that's hugely problematic, especially if you don't even bring it up as an issue. And everybody's very gung-ho right now. I understand, ooh, we can clear all the FOIA requests, but nobody ever thinks that we're buying into a completely opaque system that nobody completely understands. And I think if we are talking about government transparency, that is a big problem, right? The second thing that will happen, we are already seeing it mostly on the state government, municipal level, that training is a huge issue on the government side. Like a lot of these guys really don't understand FOIL and FOIA. And now what is going to happen if you have tools that automate it? There will be even less training, understanding, and expertise about the regulations, about the laws on the government side. Because again, if you don't have to train people to do that and you just push a button, it's very tempting. So those two pillars that I'm concerned about is A, the black box principle that potentially could increase opacity. And the second is that knowledge will just get lost, right? You're not going to have junior FOIA officers who have to crunch through it, understand the system. This is especially from the fulfilling side, is not necessarily easy stuff, right? There's a lot of carve outs. There's some decision making. There's some cases where you may have to consult with other people. And if you don't develop that expertise within those agencies anymore over time, you're just not going to have a lot of people understand it anymore.
Mhm. It's almost like building accountability for the accountability.
Yeah.
Um, so before we move on to our next question, Alvin, do you have any thoughts on that or any response to that?
Sure. I agree in large part with a lot of what Axel just said. And Axel has a very sophisticated understanding of the issue, actually, especially when Axel was mentioning interpretability, whether or not LLMs can be understood. Essentially, what these models are doing is they're thinking on a higher dimensional plane, which sounds really weird and kind of woo-woo, but they are able to think in more dimensions than we are. And these things work oftentimes similar to the human brain. As a result of that, there's a huge field of study to actually go in the black box and understand how to make these models tick. I guarantee you, there's some type of node you could push, like some type of switch you could push, that is the FOIA switch inside any of these LLMs. And the second you actually just twist that knob all the way on FOIA, the LLM would become obsessed with FOIA. And whenever it thought through any different queries or inputs, it would think through all of the different FOIA requests that it has ever seen in its training data. And that's in part how you get hallucinations. But overall, I very much agree with Axel. It's going to be a hard problem to solve. I think there are so many technological processes in the government that are inefficient, not because they should be or they have to be, and I wouldn't really call FOIA a totally inefficient system. There have been so many fantastic steps that people have taken inside the government to make this system a lot better. Uh, but there's always room for improvement. I think the MITRE's tool is pretty. I actually have no. I've heard good things about MITRE's tool, but I'll be honest. Whenever I talk to FOIA officers about their tech setup, they're not exactly happy. They see good people doing good things, like trying their best. But there are so many weird bureaucratic steps in the government procurement processes And all of these different firms offering the AI processing tools will have to go through all of those different steps. I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can use AI tools, especially with absolutely humans in the loop to make decisions to fix some of these problems, to actually make this system a lot more efficient and decrease the backlog. But that definitely remains to be seen. And just a quick flag, I'll mention the State Department's ML pilot program and declassifying old cables is absolutely phenomenal work. Like that is exactly what our government should be doing to figure out how to use ML and AI tools in the workplace. Like the State Department pilot program, if you're near a computer, like Google it, State Department, machine learning, declassification, go read a little bit about it. It's absolutely phenomenal work. That is, I think, a sample of what we will see with other FOIA processing projects across the government.
Mhm. Awesome. Let's see. So just before I move on to my next question, we just have a comment from an attendee. They said, from the processor side, we very much appreciate any efforts to educate requesters more broadly to write good requests that government folks can timely process. This is not discovery, multi-topic, multi-part, complicated requests that require many components of an agency to touch it are just unwieldy. The FOIA officer needs to know where to assign it, so pick a single topic and then provide the date range, keywords, custodians, and data types. Keep it simple. Imagine that you have to find these records in your own company computers and then write your request. So thank you. I'm actually going to copy that and put that somewhere. So if any journalists are asking, we can have that on hand for them.
And by the
Alrighty.
way, just to weigh in on that, um, that is where some of the just run-of-the-mill like ChatGPT, one thing that they're good at, and I think what they're underused, like Claude Anthropic is very good, Gemini is not too far behind, is let them audit what you do, right? Don't just ask them to create stuff, but write something out, streamline it, maybe use AI for it, but then basically say, so AI is very good at large language models with rule-based systems, right? I just filed my very own first Article 78 lawsuit. No, now 5 years ago, I wouldn't been able to do that, right? But it's rule-based stuff. It's the law, and FOIL is pretty much the same thing, FOIA, right? And so there is enough data. So you could basically just write a FOIA request. And I mean, I think what Irvin has done is just put it onto a platform and say, audit my request. What is wrong with that? How could I write it better? You can still say no if it narrows it too much, right? Is it in line with best FOIA practices, right? And so I use um, large language models a lot, not just to create stuff, but also to put things in context that I wrote and critique them, right? To see where may have gone awry. And I think for that, that could be really, really good for that, right? Or basically where it may just suggest, hey, you might want to split this into three different, more streamlined, straightforward, monothematic FOIA requests instead of creating this incredible enchilada of all the things you ever wanted to know from the federal government. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
yeah, use large language models not only to create the requests, but also audit yourself,
Mhm.
right? If what you're putting forward makes sense and is well worded and in line with the entire FOIA process.
Mhm. Yeah, that's something that I personally always try to avoid. I'm looking at it. I'm like, am I requesting too much? Am I requesting too many emails? Too far date range? Just to try and make it less of a headache for someone. Alrighty, so I actually want to throw the conversation back to Alvin. You mentioned the MITRE. I thank you for that pronunciation. The MITRE tool that some of these agencies are using. And if you go on to the website and that tool's website and that company's website, they explain this tool. And one thing that kind of popped out to me that honestly, frankly, kind of raise some alarm bells is that these AI tools are trained to sort out personally identifiable information, including social security numbers, date of birth, like all the things that are normally like redacted for us, these tools now have access to. So, I'm kind of curious if any of you have thoughts on what assurances do we have that these companies, and that these tools will keep that data safe?
Absolutely, that's incredibly important. I know most of the large language model companies, especially the frontier labs, have terms of services and terms of use with their models that don't let people like myself, developers who are making tools, keep data that goes through the LLM to, say, Google. Google specifically, that is, we use Google Gemini 2.5 Pro and 2.5 Flash. And we also use Meta's Llama 4 models. And the way we use Meta's Llama 4 model is through a semiconductor company called Grok, not the XAI chatbot. It is not Elon Musk's Grok. It is Grok with a Q, GROQ. And Grok's terms of services also forbid them from collecting the information that, say, a journalist comes to our site, throws in an article or something, files a request. There are a number of calls made to large language models where essentially information is being given to the model and inside some big prompt. And then the model analyzes that and spits it back out. The terms of use for through Grok on Meta and Google, you can't keep that information. Google does not keep that information. Meta does not keep that information. That's incredibly important. When it comes to FOIA requests in general, though, especially on the MITRE side, right? All that information. So MITRE is a quasi-governmental research organization. It's a very cool organization, and they do incredible research, figuring out how to actually impact sometimes government systems with cutting-edge science technology type stuff. And that's exactly what they're doing here. They've been in a pretty good pilot program with their FOIA assistant to help redact documents. Um, I do get nervous when it comes to just relying on an AI tool for redaction. I'm afraid that the AI tools will over redact often. I think that they might err toward the side of redaction. And that's in part because I think a lot of FOIA officers, some FOIA officers may err toward redaction. And if you took for example, if you were trying to train MITRE's AI assistant, I would be really interested in like two different data sets. One is just all of the FOIA request redactions that have ever happened across federal government. And the second is all the FOIA requests it's all of those FOIA requests that have gone to court, and then a judge has ruled, hey, this actually falls under B5 deliberative process. You can't, this information can't be released, or hey, the FOIA officer claimed that this fell under some exemption, but in actuality, it doesn't, and this information is not covered, and therefore, here you go, requester. I would be really interested to see how the tool would differ based on the training data received. I think that requesters would certainly prefer the more legalistic, the more free, just freeing information. Whereas I'd imagine the processors would either have no preference or would prefer to redact a little bit more. And I shouldn't say that on the processor side. I think that's the managers and the government side that would really have that preference. FOIA officers, one big misconception, and apologies for going off on a few different tangents there, but one big misconception I think a lot of requesters have about FOIA officers is that they don't want to help. FOIA officers love helping requesters. I have talked to, there are a few of the 100 plus folks that I've talked to who did not really want to talk to me and didn't want to give me the time of day. They're certainly in the minority. The vast majority of the FOIA requesters were delighted to speak with someone about FOIA. They usually try to get in touch to talk to people about their bad requests that need clarification, and the requesters don't answer them. They get really annoyed about that. These are people who, the first FOIA officer I ever met in real life, I was at a friend who worked for the government at their birthday party. And the person told me they were a FOIA officer, and they were very punk rock type person. Think Jason Leopold, the FOIA requester. And they said that they just absolutely, I said, why did you go into FOIA and the processing FOIA requests? They said, because I love history and I love information and I love policy. And there was nothing cooler on this earth than having a journalist send a request for information to my agency looking for some interesting documents. And then I get to go and find those documents and actually fulfill that request. And it satiates my own curiosity for how is our government working. And that is really the attitude I think the majority of FOIA officers carry with them into the job.
Mhm. So, Speaking on like the getting either too little information or too much information, I personally like if I'm plugging and chugging something into an AI system and like that AI is spitting it out, I'd honestly be like nervous. Like, what if it gives me information that, should be redacted? Like, I don't want like a signal gate or something, happen again. So, before we move into our last question, Axel, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, I mean, that
you know?
comes back to also my previous thing about the black box principle and the
Mhm.
weighing, right, of how you weigh those models, the data, right? It's tricky, right? Because how exactly what you said, you wanted to ideally have just a side-by-side study, right? What does the AI do? What do in-person full processes do now? That is most prior on a large scale with a large sample, relatively unrealistic. They're not going to spend time and money on that. And the thing is, the moment you would adjust any kind of weight on that model, you'd have to do it again, right? So that comes back to the problem with the black box principle, right? It's like that you really do not, you can only look at the outcomes and say, I guess it kind of works or it doesn't work, right? Um, but in terms of really making sure at scale that this is done properly and we understand why it is done a certain way, that is tricky with the current way AI models work. Um, and I mean, large language models will most probably be fantastic and very, very cheap at redacting stuff, which currently is extremely labor intensive. But again, I think if you have any kind of policy and decision making process, right? If we lose an understanding of why things are being done, we give something up, and I'm seeing a risk in that.
Mhm. Alrighty, well, my last question kind of touches on that. I believe both of you kind of explored extensively the benefits of using AI in the FOIA process, especially on the requester side. So looking at FOIA either on the requester side or the fulfillment side, are there any other issues that you still have question about, or like anything that we should be considering, such as items of security or pop-up oversight, anything else that we should be considering when it comes to FOIA and AI?
I have a little one. And that is way above my pay grade, but it is an earlier one of the participants of the guests mentioned bots, right? So one of the things that we're having in terms of national security, we have a very open system. You have FOIL and FOIA, you can request information, right? And while the individual nuggets may not necessarily be security sensitive. If you harvest extremely large amounts of data, right, at that point they could become security sensitive. So let's say one of the countries that are adversaries of United States, I'm not going to name one, but you can figure them out yourself. And they're just going to program bots and just basically say, all right, I'm going to harvest all municipal planning, publicly available municipal planning information of Washington, D.C.,
Mhm.
right? The individual morsels are most probably nothing conspicuous, but if you can take all of that data and feed it through an I think that can become problematic just because of the scale of it, right? And because it is becoming so much easier, and especially through agents, right, to and bots, it's kind of the same thing. To file those requests at scale, I think there will be definitely discussion how much data we are going to give up voluntarily and how we are going to shut this down, that we don't just have adversarial powers. Literally, this didn't used to be a problem because the bottleneck was like with all the information that was being collected that nobody could ever process it, right? We had that when basically we figured out that the American government is kind of spying on its citizens and recording all of our phone calls. While in theory and practice that was not the right thing to do, in my opinion, illegal, they could only do so much with it because there were no tools available to sift through all of that data, right? They had to be very selective. AI changes that, right? AI, there's really no more bottleneck. AI can, especially on a nation state level, can crunch any amount of data in a very short amount of time. And so now that is becoming a problem, right? If you're basically just harvesting data via FOIA, and then you can feed that into AI systems to analyze it, I think that could be a problem.
Mhm. That prompted a question for me, and then I'll turn questions over to our guest. Do you think that the output of the AI, like when a person uses AI in the government, does that count as like a requestable record? Um, yeah.
Absolutely. I definitely believe so, as a matter of law there. I, it's going to be very interesting, especially that will be an extraordinarily interesting legal question in about like 4 years. Right now, it is a very interesting legal question, but it will have enormous ramifications. Kind of the notes I had in answering this question,
You cut out.
oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, the notes that I had in answering this question are, there's one specific example of cons to filing FOIA requests, right? Or the big barrier to journalists using AI as a research aid. And they start off, the small, almost personal. I mean, I don't want to minimize, but the personal and then the more larger existential. And starting with the personal, I've talked to a lot of journalists. We have about 30 in our beta test right now, who are using the system. And I invited a lot of journalists. A few of them turned it down. And I asked, the three why they had turned it down. One of them said, uh, "It feels like cheating. I don't want to actually use a system that gives me an unfair advantage over my competitors. It's like cheating on a test. It's the exact same feeling that I got like when I was in high school and cheated on a test, is what the journalist said. And I thought, hey, that is a very real problem. I think that is something that we as a society, and especially those in our profession, are going to have to reckon with. As like Axel just mentioned, these things are going to be incredible for nation states to use. Imagine the possibilities. These things will also be incredible for journalists to use. I think there are a lot of, and this is into the second point, kind of existential threats here. There are a lot of folks who talk about AI safety and AI governance type stuff. We're very concerned with, for example, the meaning of work and the future of work. What is going to happen once AI tools can essentially augment all of us by replacing all of us? I believe that people in this profession, those of us who are journalists, uh, are pretty irreplaceable. Not just by the fact that our work is human. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that people will still want institutions like the New York Times, large media institutions, to serve as a signal, especially that something is credible, authentic, and real. I think for journalists who work not just for those institutions, but anyone who wants to communicate a story, I think we are all going to become more like editors than journalists. That overall, we are going to have a lot of different AI agents that are behaving at our behest. Essentially, and this is similar to something that OpenAI just released the other day for software engineers, where we have a very complicated and big code base at FOIA Friend. I've had to learn how to code, and that's in part just to manage all that. OpenAI just released a software engineering agent. It was my first time using it. It was absolutely phenomenal. It has two very small code fixes running in the background, literally right now. That would take about 30 minutes to fix. It was a piece of code that was very, very small that needed to change when someone signed up for FOIA Friend. You could type in your phone number, and if you included a dash, then it wouldn't process your registration because of the way that it was taking the dash out of the text. It's a very, very
I
simple
hate
code
to
fix.
interrupt you, but I do want to make sure that we have time for this
Right.
question. And feel free to continue to send questions in the chat. Any final questions that you guys have, we want to make sure that we get those answered. So this person asked, what about the fees? Is someone working to develop a good AI tool to estimate and calculate an invoice FOIA fees, and then also change the law so fees go back to developing better FOIA infrastructure instead of just funneling the fees into the treasury? So talking about money.
I mean, it's like that is most probably one of the uses that's pretty inconspicuous because I'm pretty sure AI will be very, very good and get very good over time to just easily assess those fees much quicker and much easier and much cheaper than it's being done right now.
Mhm.
That's 100%.
Awesome.
I think that's exactly right.
And that's a no-brainer. I don't see any problem with that. That's really just an administrational kind of streamlining thing. Just to get one more thought in. So one thing, because you mentioned some journalists didn't want to participate, cheating. I mean, one thing that we really have to recognize what these huge AI models are, the big foundation models, which is at the end of the day what we're talking about, right? And that they are just vacuums for IP without consent, right? I mean, it's the biggest intellectual property theft that has ever taken place in human history. And I mean, it had this will happen, right? Nobody's going to roll it back. But I think once in a while, you just got to stop, especially if you're dealing with journalists, right? Who've been subject to this, right? Who had their content just hovered up without their consent and integrated into training data of large language models. So I think that is just something to be acknowledged that they literally are hovering up huge
Mhm.
amounts of information that are not public domain
Mhm.
and just using it because they can,
Mhm.
right?
Awesome.
That's a problem.
So, yeah, thank you for those final thoughts. We are getting to our time here. So again, Irvin, Axel, I want to thank you for being here. For all of our participants, I want to thank you for your time and attention and for all of your great questions. If ever, feel free to drop your LinkedIn's in the chat, drop your portfolios in the chat. I think it would be great if everyone here could connect offline so that we can continue these great discussions and continue all of this. So yeah, and if you have any further questions after this session, um, feel free to send them to my email, which was on the webinar, and I'll get those to our panelists as well. But thank you guys so much for being here. We have 2 minutes left, so if anyone has final questions or final thoughts, shout them out now.
Sure. I'll just finish my thought from earlier really, really briefly. And that's that, like I'm using this OpenAI software agent to fix two very easy minor code bugs in my code. I think journalists will have anywhere from 10 to 30 agents running at literally any time that are just reading municipal meetings. Some that might be submitting, one is activated to submit a FOIA request. One is handling the FOIA request clarification process, the fees process, the expedited processing justification, all that different stuff. You get a lot of information from FOIA officers through email and through regular mail. Agents will be handling, I'd say, like 99.9% of that for all journalists within the next, like by 5 years from now or so.
One very quick last thought. So if you like it or not, this is coming with a vengeance, right? Like technology, once it's out, can put the cat back into the bag. So you better get literate and deal with it because if we like it or not, the technology is out there. It is accelerating at an incredibly fast pace. And yeah, it's like technology, once it's out of the bag, it does not get rolled back if we like it or not. So we will have to deal with this.
Yeah, might as well on now. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Alvin, Axel, and our guests. I hope you all have a great night, and I hope you continue this research and these conversations offline. But thank you guys so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for
Thanks
having me.
again,
That
dude.
was fun. Thank you.
Fantastic job moderating. Thanks again.
Yeah. Take care. Bye. Yeah.